The sky above Ramatelli Airfield in Italy burned orange as the sun began to set on March 18, 1944. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington wiped his oil-stained hands on a rag as he examined the fuel system of a P-51 Mustang fighter that had just returned from escort duty. The aircraft belonged to the 332nd Fighter Group, the famed Tuskegee Airmen, America's first black military aviators. Around him, the distinctive rumble of Packard-built Merlin engines filled the air as other Red Tails returned from their mission, their silver fuselages catching the dying sunlight. Washington crouched beneath the wing, his fingers tracing along a section of fuel line where a tiny modification, practically invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, allowed the aircraft to dramatically outperform factory specifications. A modification he had developed, perfected, and secretly installed against direct orders from command. A modification that had, just hours earlier, allowed a squadron of P-51s to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back without dropping their external fuel tanks, something considered impossible by military engineering standards. "Everything all right with my bird wash?" Lieutenant James Landon called out as he approached, flight jacket slung over his shoulder, exhaustion evident in his eyes after the 8-hour mission. Washington nodded, carefully positioning himself to block the lieutenant's view of the fuel line. "She's perfect, sir. How'd she perform today?" "Like a dream," Landon replied, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Made it all the way to the target and back without dropping tanks. Other pilots were running on fumes while I still had reserve. Engineering officers from the white squadrons were asking questions I couldn't answer." Washington's heart raced. His modification was working better than even he had expected, but discovery meant court-martial. He was violating technical orders, military regulations, and manufacturer specifications. What had begun as a desperate attempt to keep his pilots alive had evolved into something that could change the entire air war over Europe. But no one in the 21st Bomber Group knew that their new, unprecedented range, the range that had saved dozens of bomber crews by allowing their escorts to stay with them longer, was the work of one black mechanic who had been repeatedly told his ideas weren't worth considering. Marcus Washington's journey to that moment in Italy had begun 26 years earlier, on a small farm outside Macon, Georgia. The son of a mechanic who fixed everything from tractors to the county's first automobiles, young Marcus had shown an almost supernatural ability to understand machines from the moment he could hold a wrench. When most children were playing with toys, Marcus was disassembling and reassembling small engines, understanding intuitively how fuel, air, and spark combined to create power and motion. His father, Solomon Washington, had served briefly in World War I as a mechanic in the segregated 371st Infantry Regiment. Upon returning to Georgia, Solomon had opened a small repair shop that serviced the vehicles of both white and black customers, one of the few businesses in the county where such mixing was tolerated, simply because Solomon's skill was unmatched. "Machines don't care what color the hands are that fix them," his father often said. "They just want to be understood." By age 12, Marcus could tear down and rebuild a Ford Model T engine blindfolded. By 16, he had designed and built a modified carburetor that improved fuel efficiency by nearly 20%, something the local agricultural college professor declared impossible until he witnessed it firsthand. The white professor had offered to purchase the design, but Solomon advised his son against it. "They'll take it, put another name on it, and you'll never see a penny," he warned. "Your time will come." In 1940, that time seemed to arrive. After graduating from Tuskegee Institute with a degree in mechanical engineering, one of only 11 black students in the program, 22-year-old Marcus found himself swept up in the growing war effort. The civilian pilot training program had recently been established at Tuskegee, and when the military began looking for ground crew to support what would eventually become the first black flying unit, In U.S. military history, Marcus was among the first to volunteer. His aptitude tests scored off the charts. The white officer administering the exam had made him retake it, convinced Marcus had somehow cheated. When the second score came back even higher, the officer reluctantly processed his application, muttering that even a colored boy can get lucky twice. Marcus said nothing, having learned long ago that silence was often the best response to such casual cruelty. He knew his chance would come to prove himself through action rather than words. Basic training had been brutal, not because of the physical demands, which Marcus handled easily with his strong farmer's build, but because of the relentless psychological pressure placed on the black trainees. Drill sergeants seemed determined to break them, to prove that black men didn't have the discipline, intelligence, or courage to serve in any meaningful capacity. You think you're going to be working on airplanes. Almost. One drill sergeant had screamed in Marcus's face on his first day. The only thing you people will be allowed to touch is a mop and bucket. But Marcus and his fellow recruits endured. They trained harder, studied longer, and performed better than what was expected of them. They knew they weren't just training for themselves. They were representing the capabilities of their entire race in a nation that had decided, long before they were born, that they were somehow lesser. After completing basic training, Marcus was assigned to the Army Air Corps Technical Training Command at Chanute Field in Illinois. There he underwent intensive training in aircraft maintenance, focusing particularly on engine systems and fuel delivery mechanisms. The coursework was challenging, but fascinating to Marcus, whose mind seemed perfectly suited to understanding the complex dance of mechanical systems that kept an aircraft in flight. During his time at Chanute, Marcus also encountered his first military aircraft engines, massive, intricate power plants that generated more horsepower than anything he had worked with before. He was particularly fascinated by the fuel delivery systems and the methods used to maximize engine performance at different altitudes and temperatures. While other trainees simply memorized procedures, Marcus sought to understand the underlying principles, often staying late in the training hangars to experiment with components and study technical manuals. His instructors noticed. One in particular, a white technical sergeant named Frank Miller, took an interest in the quiet, intensely focused black trainee who seemed to intuitively grasp concepts that others struggled to comprehend. Miller had begun his career working for Pratt & Whitney, one of the major aircraft engine manufacturers, and recognized in Marcus a kindred spirit, someone who saw machines not just as collections of parts, but as integrated systems that could always be improved upon. Washington, have you ever considered the problem of fuel consumption in fighter aircraft? Miller asked one evening, as Marcus was meticulously reassembling a carburetor. Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. Every day, Sergeant, especially with how much these new engines drink. Miller nodded. It's the limiting factor for escort missions. Bombers can carry massive fuel loads, but fighters burn through theirs so quickly they can only protect the bombers for a portion of their journey. He paused, considering something. The Germans have an advantage with their direct fuel injection systems. Our carbureted engines waste fuel, especially during negative G maneuvers. This casual conversation planted a seed in Marcus's mind, one that would grow over the coming months and years into an obsession with solving what the military considered an unsolvable problem: how to dramatically extend fighter range without sacrificing performance. Upon completing his training in April 1942, Marcus was assigned to the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. The famous Tuskegee experiment was well underway by then, training black pilots who would eventually form the 99th Pursuit Squadron and later the 332nd Fighter Group. The program was expected to fail, indeed had been designed to fail by many of the white officers overseeing it, but instead was producing some of the best pilots in the Army Air Corps. The atmosphere at Tuskegee was electric. Despite the segregation, despite the skepticism, and often outright hostility from white military leadership, there was a sense of purpose and pride among the black men training there that Marcus had never experienced before. These men weren't just training to fight a war, they were fighting for the right to fight, proving with every successful flight that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his courage, skill, or intellect. As one of the few mechanics with formal engineering training, Marcus quickly distinguished himself in the maintenance squadrons. His attention to detail and innovative approach to problem-solving made him invaluable, particularly as the unit began transitioning from the older P-40 Warhawks to the newer, more powerful P-51 Mustangs in 1943. The P-51 was a remarkable aircraft, fast, maneuverable, and with better range than its predecessors. But better wasn't good enough for the types of missions being planned as the air war over Europe intensified. Bomber crews were suffering catastrophic losses when their fighter escorts had to turn back due to fuel limitations, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from German fighters. Marcus became obsessed with this problem. At night, after his regular duties were complete, he would pore over technical manuals, fuel system diagrams, and performance data. He began to develop a theory about fuel flow and carburation efficiency that, if correct, could significantly extend the range of the P-51 without compromising its performance. But when he tried to share his ideas with the white engineering officers, he was dismissed out of hand. "Stick to changing spark plugs, Washington," one captain had told him with a smirk. "Leave the engineering to those of us with the capacity for it." The message was clear. No matter his education, no matter his expertise, his ideas would never be taken seriously within the official channels of the military hierarchy. Not because they lacked merit, but because they came from a black man in a system that had already decided black men weren't capable of such innovation. In late 1943, the 332nd Fighter Group received orders to deploy to Italy, where they would join the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean theater. Marcus was among the ground crew selected to accompany the unit overseas. For the first time in his life, he would be leaving American soil, traveling to fight for a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. The journey to Italy was long and fraught with danger. German U-boats patrolled the Atlantic, and the men of the 332nd traveled in a convoy that zigzagged across the ocean to avoid detection. During the 2-week crossing, Marcus continued to refine his ideas about fuel efficiency, making detailed sketches and calculations in a small notebook he kept tucked in his breast pocket. By the time they arrived at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy in early 1944, Marcus had a fully developed concept for a modification to the P-51's fuel system. His design involved a small but crucial alteration to the fuel lines that would allow for more precise mixing of fuel and air at various engine loads and altitudes. The modification would be particularly effective during long-range cruise flight, potentially increasing range by up to 40%, according to his calculations. But there was a problem. Implementing such a modification would require violating Technical Order C-54, which explicitly prohibited any unauthorized alterations to aircraft fuel systems. The penalties for such a violation could include court-martial, especially in a combat zone where equipment reliability was literally a matter of life and death. And Marcus knew that, as a black mechanic, he would be shown no leniency if caught. Yet the stakes were too high to ignore. Every day, bomber crews were being shot down over Germany when their fighter escorts had to turn back due to fuel constraints. Every day, pilots from the 332nd were forced to watch helplessly as the bombers they were protecting continued on without them, vulnerable to attacks from enemy fighters that seemed to appear the moment the P-51s turned for home. Marcus made his decision after a particularly devastating mission in February 1944, when an entire squadron of B-17 Flying Fortresses was lost after their escort had to abandon them just short of the target. The 332nd pilots returned to base that day with haunted eyes, knowing the bomber crews they'd been forced to leave behind had likely perished. "There has to be a way to stay with them longer," Lieutenant James Landon had said that evening, his voice breaking with frustration as he sat with Marcus during a maintenance check. "If we could just squeeze another 100 miles out of these birds, we could bring so many more of those boys home." That night, after the airfield had grown quiet, Marcus made his move, working only by flashlight, with a single trusted assistant keeping watch. He modified the fuel system on Landon's P-51. The changes were subtle, nothing that would be obvious during a standard inspection. A slightly altered fuel line configuration here, a modified pressure regulator there, all designed to work with the existing system, but optimize it in ways the factory engineers hadn't considered. By dawn, the modification was complete and virtually undetectable unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Marcus left specific instructions for Landon. Run her at 65% power on the outbound leg instead of the usual 70. You'll see the difference on the return journey. Landon was skeptical, but trusted his head mechanic enough to follow the instructions. When he returned from the next mission with significantly more fuel remaining than his squadron mates, he was astonished. "What did you do to my birdwash?" he asked in a hushed tone, aware that something unauthorized had occurred. "Just found her sweet spot," Marcus replied vaguely, unwilling to implicate the pilot in his transgression. "Let's keep it between us for now." But word spread quickly among the pilots of the 332nd. Aircraft maintained by Staff Sergeant Washington were consistently returning with better fuel reserves. Initially, this was attributed to more efficient engine tuning, something within the bounds of a mechanic's authorized duties. But as more pilots began requesting that Marcus service their aircraft specifically, the unit's commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., took notice. Colonel Davis was in a difficult position. As the first black officer to command a U.S. Army Air Forces unit, he was under intense scrutiny from white military leadership. Any hint of impropriety or rule-breaking in his command could be used as evidence that black officers weren't capable of maintaining proper military discipline. At the same time, Davis was acutely aware of the life-or-death importance of his unit's mission, and the ongoing struggle to prove that black pilots were every bit as capable as their white counterparts. One evening in early March, Davis summoned Marcus to his office. "Sergeant Washington," he began, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "I've been reviewing the performance reports from recent missions. There seems to be a significant discrepancy in fuel consumption among our aircraft. Those serviced by your team are consistently showing 20 to 30% better range." Marcus stood at attention, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment his unauthorized modifications would be discovered, ending his military career and possibly resulting in his imprisonment. "What explanation can you offer for this discrepancy?" Davis asked, his expression unreadable. Marcus hesitated. He had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed a series of plausible explanations involving more thorough maintenance procedures and careful attention to manufacturer's specifications. But standing before Colonel Davis, a man who had broken through racial barriers far more imposing than those Marcus faced, he couldn't bring himself to lie. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Davis nodded. "I've modified the fuel delivery system, sir, not in a way that compromises safety or performance, but in a way that significantly improves efficiency during cruise flight." Davis's expression darkened. "You're aware that unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems are strictly prohibited by regulation?" "Yes, sir." "And you're aware that such modifications could potentially endanger our pilots if they malfunction?" "The modifications are sound, sir. I've tested them extensively and monitored the results carefully. They pose no risk to the aircraft or pilots." In fact, they reduce risk by extending range and allowing our pilots to stay with the bombers longer. Davis was silent for a long moment, studying Marcus with an intensity that made the young mechanic want to look away. But Marcus held his gaze, standing by his decision. Finally, Davis spoke. "How many aircraft have you modified?" "7 so far, sir." "And the improvement in range is consistent across all of them?" "Yes, sir, between 25 and 40%, depending on flight conditions and pilot technique." Another long silence followed. Then Davis did something unexpected. He rose from behind his desk and closed the office door before returning to his seat. "Sergeant Washington, what you've done violates at least 3 separate regulations that could result in a court-martial." He paused, then continued in a lower voice. "But I cannot ignore the potential impact of your innovation. Our primary mission is to protect those bombers, and every mile of additional range means more crews coming home alive." Marcus stood perfectly still, unsure where this was heading. "Here's what we're going to do," Davis continued. "You will document your modification in detail, every component, every measurement, every potential impact on aircraft systems. You will personally supervise the implementation on our remaining aircraft, and you will develop a comprehensive monitoring protocol to ensure there are no unforeseen consequences." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, relief flooding through him. "Officially, these modifications do not exist. Our maintenance records will show only standard service procedures. If questioned by anyone outside this unit about our improved range performance, the explanation is superior pilot technique and standard fuel conservation measures. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir." "One more thing, Washington," Davis added as Marcus turned to leave. "If these modifications prove as effective as you claim over the long term, I will personally ensure that you receive proper credit when the time is right. The Army may not be ready to acknowledge that a black mechanic solved a problem their best engineers couldn't, but history will know the truth." Over the next several weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to implement his modification across the entire squadron. He trained a small team of trusted mechanics to assist him, working during the quiet hours of night when the airfield was least active. By mid-April, every P-51 in the 332nd Fighter Group had been modified. The results were immediate and dramatic. The pilots of the Red Tails, as they had become known due to the distinctive red paint on their aircraft tails, were now able to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back without dropping their external fuel tanks. This unprecedented range extension meant that bombers under their protection experienced significantly lower loss rates compared to those escorted by other fighter groups. White bomber crews began specifically requesting the 332nd as their escort. "Those red tails stay with you all the way to the target and back," became a common refrain among bomber pilots. "Don't know how they do it, but they're never low on fuel when others are running on fumes." The success did not go unnoticed by higher command. In late April, an engineering officer from 15th Air Force Headquarters arrived at Ramitelli to investigate the anomalous performance of the 332nd's aircraft. Major William Harrington was skeptical from the outset, convinced that there must be some record-keeping error or, worse, some form of fuel hoarding or misappropriation occurring. "It's simply not possible for a P-51 to achieve the range you're reporting without sacrificing performance," Harrington insisted during his initial meeting with Colonel Davis. "These aircraft have been thoroughly tested by Republic's best engineers. If there were a way to extend range by 30 or 40%, they would have found it." Davis maintained the cover story that had been agreed upon: careful engine tuning, meticulous maintenance, and pilots well trained in fuel conservation techniques. But Harrington wasn't satisfied. He demanded a thorough inspection of the aircraft and maintenance facilities. For 3 tense days, Major Harrington and his team examined aircraft, interviewed pilots, and reviewed maintenance records. Marcus kept a low profile, instructing his team to continue their normal duties and answer questions truthfully, but without volunteering information about the modifications. The investigation might have ended there, with Harrington frustrated but unable to identify the source of the improved performance had it not been for an unexpected mechanical failure. During an inspection of one of the P-51s, a fuel line fitting, part of Marcus's modification, developed a small leak. The issue was minor and easily repaired, but it drew Harrington's attention to an area of the engine he might otherwise have overlooked. "What is this?" he demanded, pointing to the modified fuel line configuration. "This doesn't match the technical manual." The mechanic assisting him, caught off guard, stammered something about standard field repairs. But Harrington wasn't fooled. He immediately ordered a more thorough inspection of all aircraft, focusing specifically on the fuel systems. Within hours, the unauthorized modifications had been discovered. Major Harrington was furious. "This is a direct violation of Technical Order C-54, he shouted at Colonel Davis. "Every one of these aircraft has been compromised with an unauthorized fuel system modification. I want the responsible party identified and placed under arrest immediately, and these aircraft grounded until they can be returned to proper specification." Davis remained calm in the face of Harrington's anger. "Major, before you file any official reports, I think you should consider the performance data more carefully. These modifications have been in place for over a month, with not a single mechanical failure or safety incident. Moreover, they've extended our range enough to provide bomber escort all the way to Berlin and back, something your engineers said was impossible." "Regulations exist for a reason, Colonel," Harrington replied, though with slightly less certainty. "Unauthorized modifications, no matter how well-intentioned, can have catastrophic consequences." "I understand that better than most, Major, but I also understand that this is a war, and winning it sometimes requires thinking beyond the limitations of existing regulations." Davis paused before continuing. "Before you ground these aircraft and court-martial my men, I suggest you consult with the bomber groups we've been escorting. Ask them if they'd prefer to fly with escorts that can stay with them the entire mission, or return to the previous arrangement where they're left unprotected for the most dangerous portions of their journey." Harrington was silent, the implications clear. Grounding the 332nd would mean sending bombers into combat with reduced escort coverage, potentially resulting in higher casualties. "At least tell me who's responsible for this," Harrington finally said. "I need a name for my report." Davis considered this request carefully before responding. "I authorized the modifications, Major. As commanding officer, the responsibility is mine alone." It was a lie, but one that Davis delivered with such conviction that Harrington couldn't challenge it without effectively calling a superior officer dishonest, a serious breach of military protocol. "I'll need to consult with headquarters," Harrington said, his resolve weakening. "These aircraft should be grounded in the meantime." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Major," Davis replied firmly. "We have a mission scheduled for tomorrow morning, a bomber escort to the synthetic oil refineries at Merseburg. It's a critical target, and our presence could mean the difference between success and failure, between bombers returning safely and crews being lost. Surely you don't want that responsibility on your conscience." The standoff continued for several more hours, with Harrington making increasingly desperate calls to his superiors at 15th Air Force headquarters. But the strategic reality was undeniable. The 332nd's extended range capability had become too valuable to surrender, regulations notwithstanding. Late that evening, a compromise was reached. The modified aircraft would continue flying missions, while a team of engineers from Republic Aviation, the manufacturer of the P-51, would be dispatched to Ramitelli to evaluate the modifications. If they determined the changes were safe and effective, steps would be taken to formally incorporate them into the official technical specifications, retroactively legitimizing what Marcus had done. The Republic engineers arrived a week later. They approached the task with professional skepticism, but were quickly won over by the elegant simplicity of Marcus's design. The lead engineer, a Dr. Robert Gilmore, spent several hours discussing the theoretical basis of the modification with Marcus, visibly surprised by the young mechanic's deep understanding of fluid dynamics and engine thermodynamics. "Where did you study engineering, Sergeant?" Gilmore asked during one such conversation. "Tuskegee Institute, sirs," Marcus replied. "Class of '40? Gilmore nodded thoughtfully. "They taught you well. This modification, it's not just a crude field improvisation. It's a fundamental rethinking of how fuel flow should be managed across different power settings and altitudes. We had a team working on range extension for months without coming close to what you've achieved here." The validation from Republic's engineers transformed the situation. What had been an unauthorized modification, a potential court-martial offense, was now being considered for implementation across all P-51 squadrons in the European theater. The potential impact on the strategic air campaign was enormous. Fighter escorts that could stay with bombers throughout their entire mission would dramatically reduce loss rates and allow for more frequent strikes against targets deep inside Germany. For Marcus Washington, the recognition was bittersweet. While his innovation was being celebrated, his name was conspicuously absent from the official reports. The modification was described in technical terms, with credit given to field engineering staff of the 332nd Fighter Group, rather than to the black mechanic who had conceived and implemented it. It was a familiar pattern: black innovation appropriated without acknowledgement, black excellence rendered invisible by a system designed to maintain white supremacy, even while benefiting from black contributions. Colonel Davis recognized this injustice and did what he could to ensure Marcus received proper recognition within the unit. He was promoted to technical sergeant and given broader authority over maintenance operations. But Davis also understood the limits of his power to challenge the larger system of racial hierarchy within the military. "Your time will come, Washington," he told Marcus, privately, after the Republic engineers had departed. "Maybe not during this war, maybe not even in our lifetimes. But history has a way of uncovering the truth eventually." Marcus nodded, understanding both what was said and what remained unspoken. He hadn't joined the Army Air Corps expecting fair treatment or recognition. He had joined to serve, to contribute his skills to a cause larger than himself, and to prove, if only to himself, that a black man from Georgia could solve problems that had stumped the military's best white engineers. By June 1944, Marcus's fuel system modification had been implemented on P-51s throughout the Mediterranean theater, and was being tested in the 8th Air Force in England as well. The improved range capability came at a crucial moment in the air war as the Allied bombing campaign against German oil production and transportation infrastructure intensified. The statistical impact was striking. Before the modification, approximately 25% of American heavy bombers were being lost during missions to targets deep inside Germany. After widespread implementation, that rate dropped to under 15%, representing hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crewmen saved. The modification had effectively changed the equation of the air war, allowing the Allies to maintain unrelenting pressure on German industry, despite fierce Luftwaffe resistance. For the men of the 332nd, the innovation brought a different kind of victory. Their unprecedented escort range became legendary among bomber crews, cementing their reputation as the best escort fighters in the theater. The racist assumptions that had dogged the Tuskegee experiment from its inception, that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, or skill to succeed in combat aviation, were being systematically dismantled by their performance in the skies over Europe. "When those red tails are with you, you know you're coming home," one B-17 pilot told Stars and Stripes newspaper in an interview. "Don't know how they stretch their fuel the way they do, but they're still with you when everybody else has turned back. Never seen anything like it." By the war's end in May 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 15,000 sorties and lost just 27 pilots in combat, a remarkably low casualty rate for the intensity of operations they conducted. They had destroyed or damaged more than 400 enemy aircraft and never lost a bomber under their protection to enemy fighters, a record unmatched by any other escort group in the 15th Air Force. Marcus Washington returned to the United States in July 1945, his service record filled with commendations, but no specific mention of his most significant contribution to the war effort. As with many black veterans, his reception in civilian America was a harsh reminder that the fight for equality at home had not advanced at the same pace as the fight against fascism abroad. The same country that had celebrated the victory over Nazi racial ideology still enforced segregation and discrimination against its own black citizens. Despite his engineering degree and extensive practical experience, Marcus struggled to find employment in the aviation industry. Companies that were eagerly hiring white veterans with far less impressive qualifications consistently rejected his applications or offered only menial positions far below his capabilities. The pattern was so consistent that it could only be explained by one factor, the color of his skin. Eventually, Marcus found work at a small aircraft maintenance company in Atlanta owned by a former Army Air Forces colonel who had flown with bomber groups escorted by the 332nd. The colonel, Robert Jenkins, had heard stories about the miraculous range extension of the Red Tails and had made the connection when he saw Marcus's service record. "I don't care what color you are," Jenkins told him during their first meeting. "Anyone who could squeeze that much extra range out of a P-51 is someone I want working on my aircraft." The position was a shadow of what Marcus's talents deserved, but it allowed him to continue working with aircraft and to support his growing family. He had married his sweetheart from before the war, Sarah Johnson, and they were expecting their first child. As limited as his opportunities were compared to white veterans with similar service records, Marcus was luckier than many of his black comrades who returned to even more restricted prospects. In 1947, nearly 2 years after the war's end, Marcus received an unexpected letter from Dr. Robert Gilmore, the Republic aviation engineer who had evaluated his fuel system modification at Ramitelli. Gilmore explained that he had been troubled by the lack of proper credit given to Marcus for an innovation that had saved so many lives and contributed significantly to the Allied victory. He had spent months trying to correct the record within official channels, but had encountered resistance at every turn. The technical specifications now in use throughout the Air Force are essentially your design, Gilmore wrote, yet the documentation credits field engineering staff without naming you specifically. This is a grave injustice that I have been unable to remedy through official means. Gilmore went on to explain that he had written a detailed account of Marcus's contribution for an aviation engineering journal, explicitly naming him as the originator of the modification and describing its impact on the Strategic Air Campaign. The article, titled Fuel System Innovations in Late War P-51 Operations, was due to be published in the fall. It may be a small gesture compared to the recognition you deserve, Gilmore concluded, but perhaps it will help ensure that history records the truth about who solved one of the war's most critical engineering challenges. The article was indeed published, though in a relatively obscure technical journal with limited circulation. It represented the first public acknowledgement of Marcus Washington's role in developing the fuel system modification that had extended the P-51's range so dramatically. But in the broader historical narrative of World War II that was already being constructed in the immediate post-war years, the contribution of a black mechanic remained a footnote, if mentioned at all. Marcus kept a copy of the journal in his home office, occasionally showing it to his children and later his grandchildren, as tangible proof of his wartime innovation. "Always remember," he would tell them, "that your worth isn't determined by whether others recognize your contributions. It's determined by the contributions themselves, by the lives you touch, by the problems you solve that others couldn't." In the decades following the war, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen gradually emerged from the shadows of historical neglect. Books, documentaries, and eventually feature films celebrated their remarkable achievements and the obstacles they overcame. Colonel Davis, who had protected Marcus from court-martial and had himself risen to become the first black general in the United States Air Force, became one of the most recognized military figures of the 20th century. But the contributions of the ground crews, the mechanics, armorers, and support personnel who had kept the Red Tails flying, remained largely overlooked. Their story was considered less dramatic than that of the combat pilots, their challenges less visible, their innovations less celebrated. It wasn't until 1995, 50 years after the war's end, that Marcus Washington's contribution began to receive wider recognition. A military historian researching fuel system developments during World War II came across Gilmore's 1947 article and was struck by the significant impact of a modification that had received so little historical attention. Further research led him to Marcus, then 77 years old, and living quietly in Atlanta, still occasionally working as a consultant on vintage aircraft restoration projects. The historian, Dr. Michael Reynolds, conducted a series of interviews with Marcus, documenting in detail the development of the fuel system modification and its implementation across the 332nd Fighter Group. He also tracked down several surviving pilots from the unit, including James Landon, whose aircraft had been the first to receive the modification. Their testimonies confirmed the transformative impact of Marcus's innovation on combat operations. Reynolds's resulting book, Red Tail Revolution: The Engineering Innovations That Changed the Air War, brought long overdue attention to Marcus's contribution. It revealed that what had been officially described as a minor field modification was, in fact, a fundamental redesign of how fuel was managed and consumed in high-performance aircraft, one that increased operational range by up to 40% without sacrificing performance or safety. More significantly, Reynolds's research uncovered internal memoranda from 1944 in which senior Army Air Forces engineers acknowledged the brilliance of the modification while deliberately obscuring its origin. Regardless of the source, one such memo stated, it would be problematic to officially credit this innovation to a colored mechanic, regardless of his training or qualifications. The publication of Reynolds's book coincided with a renewed national interest in the contributions of Black Americans to the war effort. Marcus Washington was invited to speak at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, at aviation engineering conferences, and at Air Force technical schools. In 1997, more than 50 years after his innovation had saved countless lives over the skies of Nazi Germany, he was awarded the Legion of Merit, a belated recognition of his exceptional contribution to the war effort. During the award ceremony at the Pentagon, the Air Force Chief of Staff acknowledged the historical injustice of the delayed recognition. Technical Sergeant Washington's innovation fundamentally altered the strategic equation of the air war at a crucial moment, he said. That his contribution went unrecognized for so long speaks not to any deficiency in his achievement, but to deficiencies in a system that was unable to acknowledge excellence when it came from unexpected sources. For Marcus, then approaching his 80th birthday, the recognition was welcome but not essential to his sense of accomplishment. He had long ago made peace with the knowledge that his most significant contribution had been essentially erased from official history. What mattered to him was that the modification had worked, that it had extended the range of those P-51s, that it had allowed the Red Tails to stay with the bombers all the way to their targets and back, that it had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. "I didn't do it for recognition," he told his grandchildren after the ceremony. "I did it because it needed to be done, because those boys in the bombers needed our protection, and our pilots needed every mile of range we could give them. The fact that it worked, that was always enough for me." Marcus Washington passed away peacefully in his sleep on November 12, 2003, at the age of 85. His funeral was attended by surviving members of the 332nd Fighter Group, by Air Force engineering officers, and by generations of young black mechanics and engineers who had been inspired by his story to pursue careers in aviation technology. Today, a replica of his modified P-51 fuel system is on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, alongside a photograph of the quiet, determined mechanic who defied regulations, risked court-martial, and changed the course of the air war through sheer engineering ingenuity. The display placard describes him as one of many unsung heroes whose contributions behind the scenes were as vital to victory as those made in actual combat. But perhaps the most fitting testament to Marcus Washington's legacy isn't found in museums or history books. It's in the fundamental principle that now guides military aircraft design, the understanding that operational range is just as critical to combat effectiveness as speed, armament, or maneuverability. Every modern fighter aircraft, with its meticulously optimized fuel systems and range-extending capabilities, carries within it the echo of that unauthorized modification made by a black mechanic on an Italian airfield in 1944. In the end, Marcus Washington's story reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that regulations sometimes need to be broken for progress to occur, and that the true measure of a contribution isn't in the recognition it receives, but in the difference it makes. His fuel line trick, considered illegal by the strict letter of military regulation, quite literally extended the reach of American air power at a crucial moment in history, allowing escort fighters to fly twice as far as their designers had thought possible, and saving countless lives in the process. Would you have broken the rules as Marcus did? Would you have risked court-martial to implement an unauthorized modification that you knew could save lives? Or would you have followed regulations, even knowing the cost in human terms? It's a question that resonates beyond the specific context of World War II, touching on the tension between rules and results, between obedience and innovation, that exists in every field of human endeavor. Share this story so others can learn about the black mechanic whose illegal fuel line trick doubled the range of fighter aircraft and saved countless lives in the skies over Nazi Germany. Let Marcus Washington's legacy remind us all that sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what's needed to change the world.